Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. A couple of things happened yesterday which prompted me to do this video. I was doing a video yesterday about Golden Age heroes and thinking about those good old comics and those good old heroes. And then this article came out from The Guardian and it's talking about comicsgate. And I thought to myself, I should do a video on it if no one else does. But then Richard Meyer over at Diversity in Comics did a video on it. And so if you want to know what the actual article says, I'll link that into the description, the actual article and Richard's video too. So you can go and read it yourself if you want. So I'm just going to go over a little bit here. And I want to go over it because this woman who wrote this article, she is far, far to the left. And she is saying things like the attacks on comicsgate that the pros are doing right now are nowhere near enough. They should not have allowed, she's saying that the pros should not have allowed it to get to this point to begin with. So they're certainly not going far enough in her mind. And to give you, again, just a little examples of what she's talking about comicsgate and she's comparing it with Brexit and the election of Trump. And she's making the election of Trump equivalent to, and this is a quote from the article, the flourishing of American fascism. So yeah, that gives you a little idea of how batty this woman is. So the thing is, she's also talking about how customers, comic customers, are actually abusing their power. And of course, how are they abusing their power? Well, they're abusing their power by buying what they want and actually voicing their opinion, which is funny. Just in a little aside here, you do know that the more your country becomes socialist, the less your money becomes yours. And this woman, these people like her who are far left and socialist minded, yeah, they don't even think your money belongs to you now. And she's saying that you going out and buying what you want, yeah, you can't do that. As a comic buyer, you need to go out there and buy the comics by the marginalized individuals. That's what you need to do. And if you don't do that, you're an oppressor. This is basically the underlying message of the first part of the article that she's talking about. And of course, you voicing your opinion that might say that these marginalized groups who are creating comics are actually creating bad comics. Well, that of course can't be tolerated either. Of course, you can't have free speech like that. So how do you get rid of that? Well, she's probably in her mind saying that you get rid of free thought. You know, it shouldn't have got to this point to begin with, she's saying. So let's get rid of this radical thinking where you can think whatever you want and say whatever you want. Yeah, this is the underlying message of this article and how she is talking about comicsgate. And why I'm going over it is because she's talking about comicsgate as if we are toxic individuals. That's what she's doing. And it's really, really funny because of course we know that she is the toxic individual. And what's the difference between us calling her toxic and her calling us toxic? Well, that's really the key here. Because if you listen to any of my videos, you probably know that I studied politics for a while. And when you study, I studied it in the very old way of studying, which most people probably don't quite know exactly what that is. You know, I studied it as a branch of logic, basically. It's the logical branch of philosophy where you study human beings, where you study human nature, where you study human interactions, you study how people interact, just normal individuals, 1, 2, or even whole groups of individuals or countries of individuals. That's what you study. It would be the very, very old and ancient equivalent of what we think of as psychology, I guess, today. I'm not really ascribed to most psychology. I use it every once in a while. But so I study how individuals work, right? And how they relate with each other. And one of the things that always struck me is that when you have a person who does not actually have an argument or is actually trying to trick you and use sophism, basically what it is. So they're using an argument. They're not actually presenting a true argument. They're trying to trick you with their argument. When they do either of those things, what they do is they usually call you names. Now, of course, that's what the left does all the time. They call people names. But the funny thing is that usually the name that they call you, when these people who don't have an argument, they call you names, usually the name that they call you is what they are. If you want to know what the person is and where they're coming from, look at the names that they call you, especially if they have no argument, because that is a description of what they are. I say 90% of the time, that's what happens. And again, the difference between her calling us toxic and us calling her toxic is the fact that, you know, she has no argument. She has no basis to say this besides her feelings, right? Whereas we can present an argument. We can present a rational argument and show why her and people like her are toxic individuals. And that's the thing. They are toxic individuals. And we need to understand that they are toxic individuals. And the reason I wanted to talk about that was because I was doing my video on Golden Age heroes and thinking about not just the Golden Age, but the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age at the same time. And thinking about how great those comics were and how great those comics led into the 80s. But I would say by the 90s, certainly by the mid 90s to late 90s, I started to see these kinds of things. That's why I stopped buying comics partly in 1997. It was because we didn't call it SJWism back then, but it was the same thing. It was peeking its head out, and because I, could actually see these things, why, I don't know, but I could see them, and I still feel the same way about the SJWism as I did back in 1997. And I could see these things poking their head out, and there were people preaching to me. That's what it was. I didn't want to be preached to. If I want to be preached to, there's a certain place that I can go to that I can be preached to. But if I'm paying money to read a comic book, no, I'm not paying you to preach to me. And that's what they were doing, even back in the mid to late 90s. They were starting to preach to me. And I just gave it up. I was disgusted with it. And not only that they were preaching, but some of the messages that they were preaching, I was disgusted with it. And the thing is that when I gave them up, I knew that. I specifically knew that. And it is something that put me off of comics, and I think is putting a lot more people off of comics, because back in the 90s, they did it underhandedly, whereas now they don't make any bones about it. They're shoving this in your face. They're saying, I'm preaching to you, you better like it, and you better pay money for it. And they expect us to still read comic books, because that's what Marvel is today, right? They're preaching to you and expect you to pay for it. But so this has gone on for a while now, I'd say back since the mid-90s, that there has been a corruption of comic books in what its original form was, in what its form was both in the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, even into what we used to call the Modern Age in the 80s. There was always this feel-good element to comic books. And it was an underlying element that was always there. Now, I was talking about, in one of my videos, about Shazam, about the old Captain Marvel, about DC's Captain Marvel, about the old comics from the Silver Age, even from Batman and things like that. They were campy, right? And they had this kind of humor to it that no one would find funny today, and we think are ridiculous to some extent, but that's not really what it's about. It was about that it was a fun comic book back then. They were writing it because it was a feel-good thing for people. And people back then actually thought it was funny. I mean, they had shows like Beverly Hillbillies and, Green Acres, and before that, in the Golden Age, they had radio shows of the same kind, right? And so they were writing comic books with this underlying assumption that it was a feel-good thing. And those feel-good ways to write those books changed as times changed, and changed as the ages of comics changed, and would change into today. But it stopped being carried along with comics and being written in there as part of its underlying principle of what to do when you write a comic, I would say in the mid-90s. And right now, it is nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. And right now, it's nowhere to be found because of SJWism. And because these toxic individuals are writing comics. And to some extent, I pity these SJWs because they are so toxic. Their lives are made up of this toxicity that they can't write anything else. They can't write anything because when you write what you know, and all that they know is this toxic idea of putting forward these toxic ideas. That's all that they know, and that's all that these books are. And even back in the 90s, when they were starting to put some of this stuff in there, still, even when it was just popping its head up, I didn't want any part of it. I wanted there to be feel-good comics, because I can remember the feel-good comics. I can remember having read feel-good comics. I mean, I can remember not only the time, but the place where I read the Destroyer issue of Walter Simonson's Thor. And I was so excited. I jumped up and down. I was so excited. I remember where and when I was when I read the issue of Iron Man, where Tony and Rhodey were fallen out of outer space into the Earth's atmosphere, and each of them had a suit on, but only one of them could survive going through the atmosphere. I was so excited about that book. Massively excited. I can remember the same thing about issues of Justice League of America. I can remember the same thing about issues of Conan. They were amazing. When I put them down, I felt good. I felt excited. It was a feel-good book. And I just could not wait until the next issue came out. But that's the kind of things that we need. But right now, you have these SJWs and their ilk writing comic books, and when you put them down, you feel quite the opposite. You feel ill when you put some of these comic books down. Because these people that are writing them are toxic. And they write what they know, and of course, they're not actually writing it to make it a feel-good thing. They're not actually even writing it for entertainment. They're writing it in order to shove ideas under your nose in the guise of entertainment. And those ideas that they're shoving under your nose are toxic. And once you read this book, you are ingesting those ideas. And we all know that when you ingest something that is toxic, you feel ill. And that's what happens when you read these books that are coming out from Marvel right now. When you read these books that are coming out from DC right now, it makes you feel ill. You know, it doesn't just make you feel like I wasted my $5. It makes you feel like you wasted your time and you are lessened by having read this thing, which is the exact opposite of what comic books actually are meant to be. Because, again, from the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, into the 80s, they were feel-good things. I did a video on this 80s Captain America, but with Deathlock in it. And I laughed at it, and I laughed at it, and I laughed at it. The whole video was just me laughing at this book. But it was laughing at it in a good way. I felt good when I put this thing down. I felt really good. Even though all I did was laugh at it and make fun of it through the entire thing. That's what comic books are supposed to be. You know, not just to make you say that I actually enjoy spending $5 on this book, or $25 if you're thinking about comics and Indiegogo campaigns or crowdfunded comics, but you feel good about having spent your money on it, and you feel good just in general. And that's why I want to do this video, even though it's a bit of a rambling video, is because if Richard Meyer and his cohorts are actually really, really sincere about building a new industry for comic books with We Are Building a Spaceship, they need to look at that. And I know that everybody does their own crowdfunded books and they figure out and take what they want and put it in their books, but I think they really, really need to look at that as a group, that comics need to be feel-good comics. They need to bring that back again. That's what people want. They want a feel-good comic. They want to put it down and actually not just look at it and say that's worth $5 or however much I paid for it, but it makes me feel good that I read that. And I think Richard has that stuck in his mind when he's writing, at the very least, writing Jawbreakers. I wouldn't say so much Iron Sights, but these people who are putting out these crowdfunded campaigns, if they're actually doing it in order to build a new industry or bring the industry back into a healthy life, then they need to look at that very, very specific idea that when you write a comic, make sure you understand that it's supposed to be a feel-good thing. And it doesn't matter if it's a straight-up superhero comic book or one that has horror elements like Graveyard Shift, or that's fully horror, kind of like Stardust. You know, it doesn't matter what your genre is. Just keep it in mind, keep it in your head that, yeah, I want the person who buys this book to actually feel good that they have spent their money on it and read it. That's what comic books should be at their heart. And because I said all this, I think that I will go back to saying what I used to say at the end of my videos, which is make comics better by reading better comics. All right. Hopefully I've given you something new to think about. If I did, hit like, hit subscribe, leave me a message so that you give me something new to think about. All right. I'll see you later. Bye.